All right. Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you today about energy and specifically how does energy move throughout an ecosystem. So let's get started. All right. So I thought we'd start off with a little case study. So as you may know, the wolves of Yellowstone have not always been there. Back in the early 1900s, the wolves were actually removed from the area. They were a predator and they commonly killed livestock of the area. So there was a predator removal program that called for them to be eradicated. Well, later on in the years, we realized that predators actually served a very important role in our ecosystems and they were reintroduced. So in 1995, the wolves were reintroduced back into the park, into Yellowstone National Park, which was the first national park in the United States. It was really great because they could do a lot of ecosystem services. So, for example, they ate deer and they ate elk. They ate horse, unfortunately, so there's that livestock issue again, as well as lamb and other organisms. So I want you guys just to think right now, why is it environmentally harmful to remove top predators from a system? Why do you need predators in a system? Let's just take a moment and think about it. All right, so let's see if any of your answers come up in these next slides. All right, so first, if we eliminate top predators like the wolf, there's going to be no more leftover food. We call that carrion. And carrion is actually very important for organisms that are scavengers because after the kill, the carcass, some tissue is left over, and some organisms like vultures and even bears rely on that food for nutrients. So if you remove top predators, you remove those kills, and therefore you won't have any carrion left. Also, if you remove top predators, you do get a stability loss of the food web. You pull organisms from one area of the food web, and that's going to affect the other organisms that rely on that organism. Next up, you remove predators. This kind of ties into the last argument that there's no more animal or organism that can control the populations that are lower on the food chain. So for example, the wolves ate the deer, right? Well, if the wolves are removed, then the deer population explodes. So what does that do to the vegetation? Well, it actually causes the vegetation to decrease in amounts. So that loss of stability and the lack of control of the food web, again, is lost. All right, so to tie in to what we were just talking about, if you remove top predators such as the wolf, the grass or vegetation habitat actually decreases. And that is because when you kill off the predators, it allows the grazers to increase because there's no one checking their population. Well, if they're increasing and they're grazing all day, they're eating all of the grass underneath them. And so those populations of vegetation do decrease. And then lastly, we have an increase in soil erosion and compaction. And so again, this happens because grazers, if you look at their hooves, they're usually flat, right? They're kind of like this. So can you imagine that pounding the ground all day because there's more of them because there's no predators killing them. So they're doing this to the ground all day. It actually compacts the soil and it makes it so that water has a very difficult time getting in there. Oxygen is very difficult to get in there, nutrients. And so the soil does become kind of desert-like. So it leads to increased erosion because the water can't get into the soil, so it runs off. And again, nutrient loss in the soil. So if you're interested in this field of energy and how it's transformed from one organism to the next, or just even in physical science, how does energy transform from the different types, you would want to study thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations. Now, there's two basic laws that you need to know for AP Environmental Science. The first law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but it may change form from one to another. So we see this in environmental science with the use of photovoltaic cells. When you take a photovoltaic cell, what you're doing is you're harnessing the solar energy and you're actually converting it into electrical energy for our use. Okay, so since you're converting the forms of energy, that is okay under the first law of thermodynamics. It's not created nor destroyed, it just changes form. There's also the second law of thermodynamics that states that energy is not 100% efficient when it changes form. So no reaction is 100% efficient. In fact, when you convert it from one form to the next, you actually do lose some of that energy in the form of entropy. And entropy is a measure of how much chaos or disorder is in a system. And so when you do change forms from one type of energy to the next, your entropy does increase. All right, when we're talking about in biology and environmental science, a lot of times that entropy, that loss of energy, it's usually heat. And we'll talk more about the rule of 10 in just a couple slides. All right, so let's just take a little time to talk about how energy flows in an ecosystem. So as you probably know, the sun is the main source of energy here on Earth. Now, who is taking in that sunlight and converting it into a sugar? Well, those are the producers, and there's different types of producers. We're going to talk about them in a second. Okay, so who comes along and takes the energy from the producers? That's the decomposers. And then, of course, we have to throw in decomposers because they are consuming things and they are getting energy that way. But they also are very important in nutrient cycling, so putting things back into the soil for the producers. All right, so who are the producers? Well, there's two main categories for producers. You have your phototrophs and your chemotrophs. Now, photo in Latin means light, okay? So you know that these organisms are using sunlight to convert it into a sugar. And that process is called photosynthesis. So who are the main phototrophs here on Earth? It tends to be any kind of plant vegetation that you see on land terrestrially, or phytoplankton, the algae. And so phytoplankton, they are these little tiny microscopic organisms that are floating in the water, and they're actually taking in the sunlight and photosynthesizing to make that chemical sugar. There is another category of producers that's not often talked about. Those are the chemotrophs. Chemotrophs, instead of taking light, they take a chemical. And the most common chemical that is used is hydrogen sulfide. These organisms tend to be found deep down in the thermal vents, just very hostile environments. They don't perform photosynthesis. Their process is called chemosynthesis, but it's the same idea. They're taking a chemical and converting it into some form of energy storage that they can use later on. Okay, so each level of energy flow in a system is called a trophic level. And so our first baseline trophic level are called the primary producers. So these are organisms that are like plants or phytoplankton. They're taking in sunlight and converting it into a sugar. So the next big category we have are the consumers, and they are better known as the heterotrophs. And so what they do is instead of taking solar energy and converting it into a sugar, they just go ahead and consume the sugars from those organisms who have already made them. So once they take those sugars, they break them down through a process called cellular respiration to generate ATP. Okay, and so that is how they can harness the energy. And again, I hope you guys are noticing that this is all just energy transformation. It's being taken from one organism and going to another. It could change shape or form, but we're not creating and we're not destroying energy. It's simply being transformed throughout the food web. All right, so the first trophic level in heterotrophs are the primary consumers. So the primary consumers eat the primary producers. And in more general terms, sometimes they're called herbivores, but basically it's all the same thing. They are eating primary producers. So they are called primary consumers. Anything that eats a primary consumer is called a secondary consumer. So here you see the cheetah, that's the secondary consumer. It is eating a zebra, which is a primary consumer, and I'm going to assume that zebra was eating some sort of vegetation or grass, which was the primary producer. Anything that eats a secondary consumer is called a tertiary consumer. Again, in general terms, sometimes you see them named as apex predators or like the dominant consumers, the dominant predators. These are the ones that tend to be at the top of the food chain, and they are titled the tertiary consumers. Now, let's not forget about our decomposers because they're very important for nutrient cycling. They are known as the saprotrophs, and what they tend to do is they feed off dead organic material and they release nutrients, like I was saying, back into the ground. The most common that you're going to find in a terrestrial system are the fungi and the bacteria. And also remember, in AP Environmental, organic simply means that it contains carbon, and that's also used in chemistry. So organic, and I know there's different definitions of organic, but in this sense, organic just means carbon-based. So why are decomposers so important? Decomposers, they really are great because they can take nutrients that are locked up in dead or decaying organisms and release them back into the ground so that organisms like primary producers can use those nutrients. They're very good at taking the organic material and converting it into inorganic materials that can be used in the soil or water. So that leads us to food chains versus food webs. I'm sure you've used the word interchangeably. Food chains, they tend to be very simple. So they usually contain just one primary producer, one primary consumer, one secondary consumer, one tertiary consumer, and that's about it. But a food web is way more complex. It has lots of different food chains integrated into it. So here in our picture, you can see the grass is our primary producer, is being eaten by a lovely kangaroo rat, which is a primary consumer. That is then being consumed by our snake, which is the secondary consumer, and then the owl comes along, which is our tertiary consumer, and eats that. What's really important to remember is that the arrows show where the energy is going to. That's the biggest mistake I always see when people draw their food chains or food webs, diagram them. The arrows show where the energy is going. So it's going from the grass to the rat. It's going from the rat to the snake. Okay, so make sure you put your arrows in the right direction. All right, so here's a picture of a food web. So you can see it's a lot of different food chains integrated in one. So it shows the multiple ways that energy can move through a system. The more connections you have in a food web, the more stable that environment will be if something ever changes. So for example, if you have a very complex food web and one predator is removed, one predator species, the food web of course will be affected, but it won't totally collapse. Okay, whereas if it's a very simplified food web with not a lot of connections and you take out a predator, the whole entire system can be affected, and we call that a trophic cascade. All right, so that leads us to the rule of 10. So this says that, thanks to the second law of thermodynamics, that every time you consume something, you only efficiently use about 10% of what you consumed. The other 90% is wasted, and in our case, it tends to be wasted as heat energy. Now again, this is just a model, and it's not always 10% for every organism. but this is just a general rule. This also explains why there's only about 3 to 4 trophic levels on a food chain, and that is because as you go up, you do get a loss of efficient energy. And so by the time you get to the top, there's not a lot of energy left. And so that again explains why you only have maybe 4 or 5 max levels. And it also explains why predators at the top have to eat so much more, because they are eating food sources that aren't so energy efficient. All right, and then lastly, we have our pyramids. There's 3 pyramids you got to know: the pyramid of biomass, the pyramid of numbers, and the pyramid of energy. Okay, now the pyramid of numbers and the pyramid of biomass, not always pyramids. So the name is a little misleading. The pyramid of numbers is simply you go into a system and you count up how many of each organism you have and you put them in their trophic levels. Okay? The pyramid of biomass is really the measurement of how much weight is in the system. So imagine like you're going into a forest, you cut down all the vegetation and you put it on a scale. Okay, that's going to give you the number for the primary producers, right? The biomass number. And then you put all the primary consumers on the scale. Then you're going to get the biomass number for that. So again, that's the pyramid of biomass. Now the pyramid of energy, because of the rule of 10, it's always going to be pyramid shaped, because as you go up, you do lose some of that energy in the form of heat. So again, it's approximate, it's about 10%, but that explains it'll always be shaped like a nice little triangle. Okay, so I hope that has helped in your knowledge acquisition on the energy flow in a system.